The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to our About Women lecture series. My name is Susan Engel, and I direct the Adult Division in the Center for Adult Life and Learning. I'm so glad to see so many of you here this evening for this very important program. Before I introduce tonight's guest, I just want to make mention of a couple of events that are recent additions to our program. On November 2nd, we will be presenting Lady Margaret Thatcher. And, wait. And on another recent addition that's not in our brochure is on Sunday evening, November 14th, when Wendy Wasserstein will interview Neil Simon about his extraordinary career. Future About Women programs this season include a panel on the latest information on breast cancer, moderated by Linda Ellerby. And then in future weeks, we are also presenting, as part of this series, psychologist Harriet Lerner, writer Susan Griffin, and Felice Schwartz. I encourage you to buy tickets in advance for all of these programs, as many are selling out quickly. And now for tonight. Our speaker this evening has made an enormous contribution to the field of psychology and women's studies through her pioneering research, bringing women's voices into psychology, and then connecting women's psychology with girls' voices. She is currently a member of the Human Development and Psychology faculty at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University. Her present writing projects include completing a book called Recovering Psyche, A Psychology of Love, as well as working with colleagues from the Harvard Project on a book reporting the findings of their study called Understanding Adolescence, a study of urban teens considered to be at risk, and also working on another project called Women Teaching Girls. Her most recent book, and the topic of her talk this evening, is Meeting at the Crossroads, Women's Psychology and Girls' Development. Written with Lyn Mikel Brown, it furthers the voice-centered research approach and validates girls' experiences at this crucial stage in a way that no other writer and psychologist has done before. After her talk, she'll answer some of your questions, and then we'll adjourn to a book selling and signing in the adjacent art gallery, and a unique opportunity to meet this very important voice in her own right. Ladies and gentlemen, Carol Gilligan.
Thank you, Susan Engel, and thank you, all of you. I'm trying to see you through this light. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is for me to come to New York to speak about this work, because I grew up in New York. So it's like coming home to talk about what it was like and what it still is like in some ways. I grew up on the West Side, and then lived about a block away from here, so I'm kind of in the vicinity. In the beginning, you can all hear me? I can't see you, but you can hear me. Okay, good. In the beginning of Toni Morrison's novel, The Bluest Eye, a novel about two girls, aged 10 and 11, who set out to change the course of events. The narrator says that her question is not why things happen the way they do, but rather how. Why, she says, is too difficult, so she will take refuge in how. After years of talking about differences and also dissonances between women's voices and what were being represented as human voices, I also decided to take refuge in how. Why, I thought was, I decided to take refuge in how, and to begin with my colleagues on the Harvard project. We formed this collaborative group to do a study of the how of women's development, how it happens. And I discovered that that question, how does it happen, has led me into what I think of as the most radical of the work that I've done. It, in some sense, was such an innocent project. Let's just try to understand the how of women's development, go back through developmental time, starting with adulthood, with the women's voices I had initially written about, and then going back into adolescence, and then going back into girls' childhood. And that led to arriving at meeting at this crossroads that Lyn Mikel Brown and I write about, this meeting place of girl and woman, women and girls. How, the question of how, if you understand how something happens, then it raises the possibility of change. Could it happen differently? Does it have to happen this way? What else could happen at this moment? So it was a kind of opening into what I think of as a kind of blind spot. And I'll talk about that as I go on. This is also the most deeply hopeful work and optimistic work, because by revealing sort of when and how, it constantly raises the possibility for change. But I've come to think of hope as in some ways the most dangerous of emotions. I mean, because it creates such vulnerability. You know, that if you open the question again, if you dare to hope again, then you open yourself to the possibility of disappointment. And I think it certainly was true for me personally. That's why, as I said, I love coming to New York to talk about this work. And I wonder for you too, how many of you have come tonight with your daughters, with your mothers, literally, figuratively, with other women who are teachers, therapists, co-workers, or whatever, to, in a sense, reopen a conversation about relationships and possibilities. Jean Baker Miller, in the introduction, the new introduction Toward a New Psychology of Women, writes that relationships between women arouse such intense hopes among women that it also creates possibilities for great disappointment and despair, because the hope is so great that the disappointment is. And also, I think you can also add, because of past experiences of disappointments and betrayals. And the just published book, Mother-Daughter Revolution by Elizabeth Diebold and Marie Wilson and Idalise Malaway, talks about the move from betrayal to power, that in this first very pivotal relationship that in women's lives, how that could become a relationship for radical transformation. So it's in this context tonight that I want to tell the story about a journey of discovery, coming into relationship with girls' voices, how revolutionary that was, and how it opens up a radical question for women. Are there alternatives? And also, not only sort of what happens when you begin with girls' voices? I want to just briefly say, give a sense of the historical background to this kind of personal journey. In the 1960s, the two kind of poles of society I see as a magnet holding things down, holding everything in place, that that both poles were uncapped, the poles that basically about femininity and masculinity. I mean, what that dictated how women should live and how men should live. Betty Friedan, in her book Feminine Mystique, exposed that what was generally said to be ideal for women or love for women was tremendously isolating and led to isolation and madness and various kinds of, that it wasn't relationship. And then the Vietnam War began to expose, under the kind of aura of heroism and masculinity, a kind of violations and violence that led to a similar kind of radical questioning that it seems to me, despite the going backward and forward, the backlash and so forth, has continued until this time. Audre Lorde, so it's against that background that this work happens. Audre Lorde has written that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And when we set out to do this project on girls' psychology, it was against the background of the work done in the 1970s, showing that's how much psychology was in itself the master's tools. That psychology, the astonishing, the absolutely startling discovery that women had been left out of psychological research. It's like, where were we? These research samples of all men, for books on adulthood and adolescence and creativity and identity, and they were passing peer review, and no one was noticing that women were missing. No, I think it's one of the most fascinating pieces of intellectual history. And then, of course, similarly within psychology, despite hour upon hour of therapy and analysis, no one knew about the extent of incest and domestic violence. So this is a huge not knowing that was going on. And you could say that psychology, the tools of psychology, as they were, the traditional tools were maintaining the master's house. We're not going to dismantle it without radically changing the practice. Now, from that, this extraordinary not knowing, the field of psychology and its research practice and its clinical practice was disconnected from reality, because half the sample are women. And now everybody knows about the extent of violence and violation and incest. And it was women's voices that were revealing the disconnection. It was women speaking that was revealing this huge gap between psychology and reality. So the shock of discovery was that while men were disconnected from women, we were disconnected from ourselves. So that what for men, in terms of psychological processes, was a process of separation, for women was a process of dissociation, requiring the creation of an inner division or psychic split. So you can now begin to see why the work, as we approach this crossroads with girls, how this work on girls was going to become so radical, because it was going to take us to the place of dissociation and raise the question of, what if it didn't happen? What if women stay connected with women? Then that larger societal disconnection, which is the essence of patriarchy, or what's been called civilization, is going to not happen. No, it's just extraordinary, because you go from something so simple, except, of course, as we all know, it's not simple at all. Psychologically, it's huge, but something in a way so simple to something so hopeful. So let me talk about the journey. First of all, I think it was the move to, as you'll see, to the Laurel School in 1985 after a series of studies at other schools, because of the presence of younger girls that was crucial to this journey. And the second thing that was crucial is that this work was done in collaboration as part of a collaborative group which we established at Harvard that involved students and faculty, but we went as a group of women to begin to listen to girls. And if we had gone individually, none of us would have been able to have stayed with what we were hearing. And so it was that sense of we would, being there with each other, saying, well, just, stay a little longer, listen to this. Let me begin. I want to start by tuning your ears to to girls' voices. Anita, 8 years old, is wearing a green and blue plaid jumper with a crisp white blouse. I want to say just one thing in passing. I know that, and I'll say at the end what, of course, you'll expect me to say, which is this work is only a beginning. It opens a conversation. It's an encouragement to go and talk to more girls and have more conversations between girls and women. It's not in any sense, it's the beginning, it's not definitive, but it opens a series of questions. But people sometimes ask, why did we start at girls' schools? And the answer is only girls' schools were willing to support this work initially. And I really think that's extremely important. It was women at girls' schools and also men at girls' schools who said we can't teach girls if we don't know about girls, and went to their alumni and got money at a time when otherwise if you went and said, I want to study girls, people, why would you want to do that? As one girl herself said at the beginning of this in 1981, what could you possibly learn by studying girls? Anita, 8 years old, is wearing a green and blue plaid jumper with a crisp white blouse. She has just returned from recess, thrown her coat in her locker, and is ready now to begin her interview. The two of us sit in a corner outside her classroom. The murmur of girls' voices edge into consciousness whenever we pause. She's shy but interested. We remember each other from last year when I visited her class to describe the study, and she thinks she remembers something about the stories in the interviews. Some of the questions are hard for her, but nevertheless, and there are stops and starts, pauses and silences now and again. As we near the end of our time, she begins to fidget in her seat. Her eyes wander to the pencil she holds in her hand, her ears to the sounds behind the door. She asks if she can hear her voice on the tape. Better yet, can she have the tape? After we finish, we listen to our voices for a few minutes. It's funny and a little embarrassing. It doesn't sound like us. This memory of Anita captures our impressions of the 7- and 8-year-old girls we listen to. The we here is Lyn Mikel Brown and myself, and by extension, the other members of the Harvard Project, Elizabeth Diebold, Judy Dorney, Barbara Miller, Normie Noel, Annie Rogers, Jill Taylor, Deborah Tolman, Janie Ward, and Mark Tappan. Before talking to each girl in the second grade class, we observed these girls for a short time, watched them work together, and ready themselves for recess and dance class. Their brightly painted pictures and projects lined the halls, claiming this space in the building as their own. Bringing these small bodies to rest even for a short period of time seemed almost unnatural. So used were we to seeing them in constant motion, both at work and at play. Anita and her classmates speak of their thoughts and feelings about relationships in direct ways, describing their willingness to speak out to those with whom they are in relationship about bad or hurt feelings, anger, resentment, or frustration, as well as feelings of love, fondness, and loyalty. These 7- and 8-year-old girls say matter-of-factly that people are different, that they may disagree, and as a result, sometimes people get hurt. While they speak about the importance of being nice, they openly acknowledge that sometimes they do not feel like being nice. They know that they can hurt others, and they speak about being hurt by others. In this sense, their relationships seem genuine or authentic. These young girls tell stories of times when they refuse to take no for an answer. If they think someone is not listening, they'll try again. And if that doesn't work, they often find creative, though perhaps disruptive, ways to be heard. Tuning our ears to the voices of 8-year-old girls in our study and to the stories they tell about relational conflicts, we begin with Diana, who says that she feels bad because her brother and sister keep stealing her mother's attention at dinner, interrupting her when she tries to speak. One night, Diana's response to this problem was to bring a whistle to the dinner table. Sometimes I transpose this solution to Harvard faculty meetings. When she was interrupted, she blew the whistle. Mother, brother, and sister, she says, abruptly stopped talking and turned to her, at which point she said, quote, in a normal voice, "That's much nicer." Diana's classmate Karen tells of a time when she was so upset with her teacher for not calling on her that she walked out of the classroom. She explains, quote, "She picked someone else and the same thing happened yesterday, so I walked out. I just lost my temper, I guess. I don't do it very often." The interviewer says, "Was there anything else you were thinking about?" "When people walk into class and see me and think that I got in trouble and that's why I was outside the room. And I wasn't in trouble, I just couldn't take it. So I guess I just left, because I didn't want people to make fun of me. I wanted to answer something because she always chooses someone else, and for once I wanted her to have chosen me for a problem that was really hard." Interviewer says, "So your decision was to walk out of the room, and do you think that was the right thing to do?" "Yes. Because I just don't think that if I want to do something, I should be able to do it, and I just lost my temper. So I guess that's why I left. I think I should have my chance to do a hard problem." "Does the teacher know why you left the room?" "She wouldn't listen to me, but I told her, so I guess she knows." Karen, like someone explaining simple laws of physics, says that because she said what she was thinking and feeling, her teacher knows it, although she may have chosen not to listen. These girls carry with them a strong belief that they know what's going on in the relational world and are willing to act on their knowledge. To ignore her feelings and ideas is a mistake, Melissa warns, because maybe you have something important to say, and if they don't listen to you, then they may miss out on something. These 7- and 8-year-old girls blow the whistle on relational violations. We call them whistleblowers in the relational world. In other words, they simply name what's happening. They blow the whistle on relational violations such as interrupting, ignoring, hurting people's feelings by dramatizing their experience. Diana's whistle recreates in others what she feels when she is interrupted. By leaving the room, Karen suggests she might as well not be in class when her repeated efforts to answer a question are not attended to. These girls interrupt the surface calm and quiet of daily life with their insistence on staying what is happening between people. Tracy, who understands her parents' inattention and at times is even willing to make excuses for it, draws a line at a certain point. Quote, "I understand they're busy, but if it was really important, I would have to say, grab them. Even if they wouldn't listen to me, then I would be really mad if it was really important. If my mom doesn't answer," Lydia explains, "I have to yell. Then she gets to hear me. I mean, I want her attention. I wouldn't have yelled if she had listened." The capacity of these 8-year-olds to be openly angry, to be, quote, really mad, to be disruptive and resistant, gives them an air of unedited authority and authenticity, and reveals their simple, straightforward relational desire to speak and to be listened to. We struggled, we meaning as members of the Harvard Project, when we began to hear these voices of these younger girls, because we wanted to hear initially only the niceness. To say ourselves how relational these girls were, which they are, how connected, how empathic, how sensitive to other people's feelings, how they show those qualities which in past work we've identified, and others too, as strengths in women, and would to say, yes, they're evident in girls too. Girls live deeply relational lives. But the girls are naturalists in the human world, and what they do is they name everything. So it was hard for us at first to hear what we were hearing, that is, girls' naming of the full range of human feelings. Yes, they talked about their desire for closeness and love and comfort and their empathy with people's feelings, but they also talked about their anger, how it felt not to be listened to and heard, their jealousy and so forth. It was the whole range was voiced. Once we heard this, it was like a revelation. because the things that are characteristically said about women and women's psychology wasn't true of these girls. And then we began to put this together with a century-long observation that girls, for the most part, in childhood, even across a range of experiences, often painful experiences, show remarkable psychological resilience. And it's at adolescence that girls begin to lose their psychological resilience and suddenly show high incidence of psychological suffering and trouble, depression, eating disorder, and so forth. So there was something about these young girls that was calling into question, sort of accept that women can't deal with anger. Well, these girls are talking about being mad, that girls were not fitting the description of women. And girls were reopening the whole question about what happens in development. We had to fight. We found the girls' voices. I mean, their actual voices were both familiar and surprising. It was like, oh, I know that voice. And then, how is she saying this? And we had to fight the tendencies in ourselves to say what girls say other people say to them, which is, it's not nice. You'll hurt other people's feelings. No one wants to know what you think. People won't like you if you say that. I mean, and you can add all your own versions that you carry around in your head. You know, what a fresh little kid, you know, all that sort of kind of stuff. So that, for example, to give you an example which heightens this issue, Jessie, who's 8 years old, tells a story about when she went to play with her friend, and her friend had another friend over, and the two of them weren't playing with Jessie. So what Jessie did is she went up to her friend and whispered into her ear, this isn't any fun for me, just sitting here. She said, if you're not going to play with me, I'm just going to go home. And the interviewer said, you know, what happened then? And Jessie said, my friend said, just go home. Now, once you hear this, you have to ask, what happens to that? I mean, what happens to that? And Needy, who's 13 in our study, tells a very similar story where she and her friend and her, quote, Needy's, quote, best friend whom she said she hated. I think an experience only an audience of women can understand. But she had to be nice to her because their mothers were friends and their sisters were friends. But she and her other friends were supposed to go to camp with this hated best friend. So they made a plan that they would switch and go to a different camp and not tell the other girl, but the other girl heard. And then the other girl said to them, and now remember Jessie, the other girl said, can I go to this other camp with you? And Needy says to her, if you want to. So you really have to think about that move. At that point, the idealization of relationship and the false voices make the relational world treacherous. Girls' voices broke everything open. What happened, we began to ask, to these frank, fearless voices of these younger girls, and also their absolute canny astuteness about when to speak and when not to speak. As we began working with girls on a weekly basis, Normie Noel, Annie Rogers, and I, we learned that girls don't smile all the time like women. And that they watch, and it's a very different kind of coming to relationship. The older girls were so radically different from the younger girls, they began not knowing what the younger girls know, and this not knowing, this coming not to know, was marked in our interview data by the phrase, I don't know, which often covered exactly what girls knew, but what was so disruptive. Often in counterpoint with the question, phrase, you know, asked, I think, as a question to women, do you know? And if I said what I know, would you know it too, so I could talk to you without feeling crazy or all alone? It was as if girls were asking women, are you a member of the underground? Is it safe for me to speak to you and say what I know? The ways in which voice falters as girls take in adult voices, women's and men's, internalizing what is initially to them a foreign voice, and you hear dotted through their own kind of narrative. I always think of girls watching the human worlds like people watch the weather. It's constant daily observation of what's the human weather today? How's everybody feeling? Who's with who and what's going on? That kind of thing. And threaded through these phrases, it's better to cooperate than fight, and that they take in, that begin to voice over their voice. The cultural voice comes in very strongly at adolescence with sexuality and concerns both about sexual attractiveness and also concerns about sexual violations, sexual violence, and physical danger that girls are in. And at the same time, with secondary education, girls are taught how, quote, we think, and we all know who that we was. So, that sense of coming in. These are familiar ways of the internalization of a voice that voices over one's voice, what Dana Jack, author of Silencing the Self-Depression in Women, calls the over-I, EYE, where you learn to look at yourself or listen to yourself, and the socialization. But the other thing that was very striking in this research that takes this work to another level of understanding how this happens is girls were describing an impasse and describing it very clearly. If I were to say what I'm feeling and thinking, one of the girls said, no one would want to be with me. My voice would be too loud. The word too is always key. Too loud, too smart, too sexual, too, so the sense of less. On the other hand, if I don't say what I'm feeling and thinking, no one will be with me. No one will know what's happening to me. I'll be all alone. Either way, in other words, I'm going to lose my relationships. And girls were describing and looking to women and saying, in effect, what should I do? What did you do? When you thought, if I say what I'm feeling and thinking, I'll lose my relationships, no one will want to be with me. And if I don't say what I'm feeling and thinking, no one will be with me, I'll be all alone. And at that point, girls look very acutely to women. My sense is this dilemma is real. And girls are saying, in essence, saying it almost explicitly, oh my God, I see it coming. I'm losing my voice. I'm losing my relationships. If I give up my voice, I can keep my relationships, but what kind of relationships is it if I'm not speaking? Where am I in these relationships? They see the problem. And as we did this work, suddenly we began to pick up on all the women novelists and poets who have seen this and described it. We're talking about The Edge of Adolescence. Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre, says at the beginning of the novel, I was a resistor. She says, her word, she's accused by her Aunt Reed of being dishonest. She said, if I were dishonest, I would have said that I loved you when I do not. This is the voice that's it. We could, this is where Margaret Atwood and Cat's Eye described girls coming to a chasm, a ravine, literally going to, you drown in it, and images of drowning and so forth. Maxine Hunt Kingston talks about the throat pain. Michelle Cliffs writes about having one's throat slit. That there's a problem of what had seemed ordinary until this point, having a voice and being in relationships with all their complexity, now begins to seem treacherous. There are two incommensurate realities, and I think every girl has to figure out what is she going to do. If she doesn't stay with her experience, she'll lose her footing, she'll lose her balance. She'll be constantly off balance. What do you want me to say? What do you want me to do? How do you think I look? That kind of thing. And if she stays with her experience, she will be out of touch with what is socially constructed as reality, what people call relationships, what people call an authentic voice, so forth. So in other words, you have this not appearance reality split, but experience reality split. And I want to read you Judy's description of that split. For Judy at 13, in other words, at this point we began, when I said, how does it happen? How are girls going to manage this moment? Where it's as though you have, one foot on each, kind of on two logs and they're starting to drift apart. That's but you have to stay with your experience and you have to stay what is generally taken to be reality. And what we found is some girls find very creative solutions. Some girls find very costly solutions. but that everyone is dealing with a problem in one way or another. And that was the sense of. So here's Judy. For Judy at 13, feeling and knowing have become, quote, two different things. The knowing, Judy says, sort of comes from the brain, like your intelligence part, like your smartness, your brightness, your education part. And your feeling is something that it doesn't matter if you have an education or not. It's just like something that you can't put into words, that you can't really explain, but it's not, I don't know. Do you hear it? I mean, she's beginning to talk about two kinds of knowing. Your brain knowing, she'll say more, but as she begins to know, she starts to say, I don't know. It's just like a deeper sort of knowing than intelligence knowing, because intelligence tells you no, bad, yes, good, and all that. In referring to this, quote, deeper sort of knowing, Judy says, I'm pointing to my stomach, which seems to be the bodily center of this knowing feeling. Quote, whenever I feel like something bad is going to happen or feel scared or something awful, I can feel it in my stomach. A gut feeling that you're not doing something right, or you're doing something that you don't really care about, whether it's right or wrong. This feeling, Judy continues, quote, is an internal sort of knowing that it just has to do with, like, not your brain, but more your mind. A mind sort of has your real thoughts, and a brain sort of has the intelligence. Do you see the two things going apart? Mind and brain, your real thoughts and what's called intelligence. What you learn in school, like all that sort of thing, physics and statistics and all that, but your mind is sort of associated with your heart and your soul and your internal feeling and your real feelings. Yet while, quote, no one else can really affect the feelings that you've had because someone can't say you don't feel this, you do, people, Judy explains, can control what they're teaching you and say this is right and this is wrong. That's control, like into your brain. But the feeling is just with you. The feeling can't be changed by someone else who wants it to be this way. It can't be changed by saying, no, this is wrong, this is right, this is wrong. Some people can name lots of different things any different way, like you can name something innocence, and you can name this wrong. And that's the way someone put it into my head. Yet, she says, it still comes out inside you the same way. As Judy describes the very process of knowing what she knows through her feelings, described by other names or covered over with, quote, what people put into my head, she finds herself struggling for words that I don't even know exist, or my feelings that I can't even say, something like that, I don't know. But Judy does know that this has happened to her, that, quote, when we grow up, we sort of forget about our mind, and we are behind, so that like right now, when I'm trying to explain things I'm not familiar with, the mind, because I forgot about that part of me, so it's too hard to put it into words. And yet, of course, she has put it into words to the woman who is sitting with her. In an extraordinary moment, Judy begins to think and feel her way through her experiences, and in the process comes to her own theory of development. I think that maybe really young children have mind more than anyone else, because I don't know, they don't have much of a brain. And I think that when you get all your mind stuff, because that's the only thing you really have then, I think that's when you get all your mind stuff, because it's the only thing you really have then, because then you transform some of the mind things to the brain. So then that starts to evolve, and that's sort of like the way you're brought up. It goes into your brain. And then I think that after a while, you just sort of forget your mind, because everything is being shoved at you into your brain. I mean, Judy continues, using the very language that signifies her own loss and forgetting, it's sort of like something that happens gradually, and I mean, I don't know. It's sort of, I mean, some people, I mean, everyone has it, a little of it, but they can't really acknowledge what it is. I mean, they just know it's there. Working through the lifespan, Judy retraces her own experience of how, quote, you just sort of forget your mind. Like little babies, they can't understand. They have really nothing because they're just starting, but then by like 7, they have the most mind, but they're starting to lose it, actually. With what you learn in school and all that's shoved into your brain, Judy explains, people seem to be just like sort of gradually forget about that and then just worry about the sums and totals of checks and stuff, and it's sort of stagnant I mean, it's sort of like they have other things on their minds and they don't want to worry about the feeling, or maybe perhaps that since they don't know what it is, they don't want to have to worry about it. They don't really acknowledge the fact that they don't really understand it, but they always sort of have it. Shifting to speak of the it, as she traces how people lose their minds, Judy reads into the future to the end of life. When you start to realize that you're going to be dying soon, I think that perhaps then some people start to get it back. Because they're sort of sick and tired of all that brain stuff. Maybe that's why grandparents get along so good with grandchildren. Because they're really old and they're really young and they sort of connect. All right. Judy, other girls talk about Judy's just describing a process of dissociation, a process of inner splitting. You can hear it. Other girls talk about the division between her experience of what they hear their mothers saying or what they observe going on in the household and what is said to be the myths, the romance myth of society and so forth. This is the edge where girls see the framework. They see the framework that they're in and they'll often voice it. It happened right in the center of our own research where, I would interview a girl, 11-year-old, and, say what psychologists say, which is, this is completely confidential and it's just between you and me. And she said, and your tape recorder? And I would then go on with a psychologist sort of setting the framework, and nobody will, know about this except members of the research team. And she said, then why don't they all just come in here? So it's even in the context of the research study, do you want to see the frame in which you're working and the relational fudges? Or, you say to the girls, basically, if you'll come into this relational framework and not see, then you can be with me. And so the girl then has to struggle with that. At this juncture, to see that in some ways to have relationships it's necessary to start not knowing what one knows, and also therefore to start idealizing relationships so that what gets called relationships often don't feel like relationships, and girls name this. At the same time, what is called a nice voice, or the kind of voice people like to hear, or the kind of voice people will listen to and take seriously, is often experienced and heard by girls as a false voice. And they watch then as almost, it's like incredulous. I think of it as like a kind of harvest moon rising over the sort of late elementary school classroom, as these images of these voices and these images of relationship, which to girls are patently false, are taken as true and real and good and rewarded, and girls then don't know sort of what to do and how to move in the face of it. This edge, as I said, marked in women's poems and novels all the time, of this dissociation, this chasm, and also, very key, girls' resistance. I find when talking about this work, what often gets picked up is the loss, but not the resistance. In other words, people talk about what girls lose in the course of growing up, but to me, the strongest finding of this research is girls actively struggle against these losses. And so that's what sets up the dynamic for women and men who are in relationship with these girls. Because if you yourself have accepted this loss as necessary, then girls start taking in the phrases, well, life isn't fair, and this is how it is, and it would be too dangerous, and one reimposes on the next generation of women the losses that we have come to think of as necessary or natural or inevitable or normal or good. So girls reopen for women, and in different ways also for men, these losses of voice and losses of relationship. What my colleague Annie Rogers calls ordinary courage, picking up an old definition of the word courage, which is to speak one's mind by telling all one's heart. Jory Graham, in her poem The Age of Reason, writes, "The honesty of things is where they resist, where only the wind can bend them back." And where we came to, this crossroads, was we came to a place of honesty, and what we observed was girls' resistance. At first, what it was simply was a healthy resistance to losing voice and replacing real with idealized relationships. And I understand girls' resilience through the elementary school years, the fact that girls show less psychological symptomatology, even in the face of stress, to the fact that psychologically, if you know what's happening, I mean, it may be very painful, like Jessie's experience with her friends, and I mean, it may be very sad, angering, painful, but at least you don't go crazy. It's when you feel something happening and it's said to be not happening. So this healthy resistance to losing voice in relationship that girls show explains their psychological health and strength up until adolescence. The problem is at adolescence, this healthy resistance to losing, a voice that is connected with their body, with breath and sound, with thoughts and feelings, and with a rich resource of language, because at the child level, girls have the language for their feelings. I mean, that the more complex, you can see even Judy is struggling with language, but still she's able to find some way to name the split, even though it would seem confusing, and we can more or less follow her. Girls are resisting losing a voice that's connected with desire, an erotic voice, and they're also resisting losing a political voice, that is, a voice that believes in its capacity to speak, even in the face of greater power, as Diane brings the whistle to the dinner table. That's much nicer, she says. This experience-reality split, where women's experience is at odds with reality, that's the different voice. That's what was called connected knowing by Mary Belenky and Blythe Clinchy and Nancy Goldberg and Jill Tarul. It's what's called maternal thinking by Sarah Ruddick. A voice that's tied to experience that's out of touch with what has been socially constructed as reality. So you have this healthy resistance, girls resisting giving up relationship to have something called relationships that don't feel like relationships, giving up a voice that is connected to their bodies and to their feelings and thoughts and to their language for a voice that they themselves will readily hear as false. I mean, wonderful, kind of skits that girls will do at this point, saying, one girl will say, I said to my mother, Mom, are you angry with me? And she said, no. So they're listening to what are false and true voices, but if that's called a nice voice, then it's very confusing. So the healthy resistance to giving up relationship and losing voice tends to come under pressure because of this sense of, if I speak, I'll lose my relationship. So that then we begin to see a tension, which is what we describe, between what we call psychological resistance, which you probably, which is familiar from the literature on trauma, from Judith Herman's work on trauma and recovery, where people in the face of trauma or stress start not knowing what they know. They dissociate. It's called dissociation, it's called repression, it's called denial, but it's basically when one begins not to know what one knows. And that I don't know, you know, is watching girls in the middle of an active process of dissociation. Do I have to not know what I know in order to be with you? I know all about lies, one of the girls in the study said. My house is wallpapered with lies. And you see, when people talk about wanting to hear girls' voices, it's wonderful for girls to have strong voices. I mean, would you like to hear what she knows? And everything that we read about depression in women and domestic violence, if girls are just simply observing, naturalists in the human world, observing the scene, they'll tell you what they're seeing at home. I mean, they're seeing depression in women, they're seeing domestic violence. What happens at school? I've sat in classrooms where in Halloween teachers have read stories about, Halloween stories, ghost stories. In every story, a woman is a victim of some kind of horrendous, violent act. And you watch the girls and they're looking at the ceiling because they're not supposed to be hearing what they're hearing. And you begin to see the formation of either, which I think is healthy, an underground. The girls start looking at each other and passing notes. It's, in the sort of, can you believe this mode? And they leave the classroom and, then they start giggling. I mean, trying to hold on to the reality in terms of what's going on. Or you get the dissociation, the not knowing, the confusion, which feels overwhelming, particularly if girls are isolated from one another and not talking. And we contrast this psychological resistance, the not knowing, with the political resistance, that is the formation of an underground, or the outspokenness that to keep voice and stay in relationship means deeply, radically to challenge a patriarchal world. That is the dissociation within women and the disconnection from women, which maintains and is maintained by patriarchy or civilization. It's for this reason that women's psychological development, women's healthy psychological development is revolutionary. And this is the moment where that question is brought to the surface by girls' resistance. So that's why it's important not to immediately talk about losses, because the question is, is this loss necessary? Girls hold this transformation for women. They reopen the question in every generation, and they hold this relationship between the past and the future. For every woman, in a different sense for men, but for every woman they raise the question, where am I in relationship to this world which I'm living in? What happened to me? What was my experience? What was my relationship to the past when I was a girl? My relationships with women and men at that time? And what's my relationship to the future, the next generation of women? Am I just going to be a vessel that passes this along, or what do I believe in, what do I want, and how can I change this? So finally, last part, the hope. First of all, I want to talk about voice, because our method is voice-centered, and voice is essentially transgressive. I wrote a book called In a Different Voice, thinking that by voice I meant voice. No, I really did, instead of the metaphor of voice and the concept of voice and so forth and so on. Meaning you can hear dissociation and you can hear disconnection, but I really learned the underpinnings of that by learning the voice work of Kristin Linklater. And I wanted, and how voice works in the body. And a lot of the arguments about is it nature, is it culture, and that kind of discussion that's so much, so contentious these days. Voice is very transgressive because it crosses boundaries. Voice is in the body, but it's also in language and in culture. It connects both the physical world of breath and sound and the psychological world of thoughts and feelings, and the cultural world of words, rhythm, and language. It also, through voice, it's a kind of voice, speaking and listening is a kind of psychic breathing. It's a constant relational exchange. And when we had to ask, how come girls know what they know? How do girls know so much about the psychological world? A lot of the answer is they listen, as they'll tell you. They speak and they listen. It's like taking soundings all the time. And the girls will speak in places that are, quote, resonant, where their voice is resounded or resonant with, or it doesn't produce what comes back is encouraging rather than dead or flat. And in our interviews, we found that when women modeled, quote, good women, as psychologists or whatever, in interviews with girls, girls were either good girls or bad girls. But if a woman was in a sense, authentically present and spoke from herself, then often the girl did too. So we'd have 11-year-olds where you'd suddenly see there was that 8-year-old lively girl suddenly in your presence because you asked a genuine question instead of just kind of following the practice. So a lot has to do with these relationships. And I just, in passing, and I'll talk about it more in the question period if you want to know, I wanted to mention that those of you who are interested in how voice works in the body, because we began to understand the disconnection at adolescence by seeing that if girls are told to hold their stomachs in and not breathe, then immediately you're constricting voice. And if you're told that if your desires come into your voice, you'll be in danger of various kinds of violation or disconfirmation or being made to feel crazy by being told that what you're saying isn't true, then suddenly voice gets cut off from breath and sound and from feelings and your own thoughts, what Judy calls your mind, and then there isn't much of a language, and so it becomes harder and harder to speak. Anyway, the end of October in New York, the last weekend in October, Kristin Linklater and Normie Noel are going to do a weekend voice workshop, And I mean, there'll be flyers available with the books, but I have found this work it gave a kind of physics to the psychology to show how this happens and also how you can undo it. So I just want to simply talk about the process of change. To see the possibility of something new is to realize that what happened didn't have to happen, which brings up very tumultuous feelings. You realize a loss that was perhaps unnecessary, not necessary, that something had been unspoken and so it will feel huge, too large, too small, that what had been lost, I mean, the hallmarks of loss, what you lose, you tend to idealize and to denigrate. I mean, to see as incredible and also like, who wants that? You know? And the responses to loss are anger, I mean, that the loss happened, and sadness. So to be in the presence of girls for women is going to raise these kinds of feelings, and you cannot do it alone. I think that to raise the possibility of change, to say this is how it happens, this is when it happens, and it doesn't have to happen, creates all kinds of, it has to happen that way. And that's partly the way I understand, I mean, how this work on women and girls and connecting women with girls has led, as far as I can see, in the past year, to articles in The Nation and the New Republic and The Atlantic attacking in a different voice. And I think, well, wait a minute, that book came out 11 years ago. Like, why are we talking about that again now? And in a certain sense, I think because this new work raises the possibility of change, and I think that one of the first reactions to really sensing that things could change is to say, no, they can't. And then, you can go back to your life. Maxine Hung Kingston, at the end of The Woman Warrior, has a wonderful image of change. She talks about a daughter joining her mother with a pipe song, flute song, and she says, the beginning was hers, and the ending is mine. And it's a wonderful image of that joining across generations. I'm saying it's possible then to end what Delma Hine in her book refers to as the erotic silence among women, that is to end the silencing of the voice that speaks of desire. It's possible to end the political silence and to realize the actual political power of women as a group. And that one way, the power from this work is the power of beginning with girls as they develop erotic and political voices, and how women are affected by girls. And my last reading is I just want to read that part of the end of Meeting at the Crossroads. It was with girls that the women first began to experiment with change. This was in a school. The easier time to begin to listen and speak in new ways was when we were working with the girls, and we all felt a sense of knowing wonder when they responded so quickly to us. Claudia Boatwright, a most courteous and also scrupulously organized teacher, found herself permitting a loud personal argument in her classroom and was astonished to be thanked by the two girls for not interrupting them when it reached its natural conclusion. I mean, it was very hard for her to allow this very loud argument to go on and not step in, and silence those voices in the middle of the school day. In another class, Claudia actively resisted her impulse to close off an emotionally tense conflict over a heated political question. She'd come to see confronting conflict openly with strong feelings in public as essential to young women's education. Like Nora and her friends, that is the 9-year-old in our book, who she and her friends talk on the phone and they scream at each other and they cry and they have these long conversations, and that's how they work out their conflicts. And taking the time they needed. The young women in her class spoke passionately about the Palestinian question, confronting rather than avoiding or defusing a political conflict that was confusing, frustrating, complex, and emotional. As Claudia resisted her impulse to diffuse this emotionally volatile classroom conflict, so she also let the class run over and continue beyond the end of the hour. In other words, she was not modeling women need to stay within the structures. And if women model the possibility of going over these edges, then girls can do the same thing. Across a range of ages and contexts, women began listening to their own voices and also to the voices of girls. Strong voices and open disagreement still aroused discomfort, but we found ourselves hearing and encouraging girls' strengths. Linda McDonald, a preschool teacher, responded to a girl who came to her troubled by the behavior of the boys on the playground by encouraging her to speak directly to the boys and to use her, quote, big girl voice. Nancy Franklin, an upper school English teacher, stayed with her student when the student wrote about Andrew Marvell's poem, To His Coy Mistress. You remember that one? If there were world enough in time, this coyness lady were no crime. In a way that posed a radical challenge to conventional readings, rather than interpret the poem from the point of view of the poet who was, quote, trying to convince a reluctant young lady that they should make love where there's still time. Her student Angeli read it from the viewpoint of an innocent but perceptive and language-sensitive young girl like herself. Angeli called this poem morbid and found it terrifying and chilling. When Angeli received negative comments and low grades from Nancy Franklin's colleagues at other schools in a cross-grading exercise designed to ensure consistency of standards, Nancy chose to stay with Angeli and challenge the standards. When her colleague wrote wrong, Nancy said, I don't think Angeli is wrong. Where her colleagues concluded that Angeli did not understand carpe diem, Nancy found in Angeli's response to the poem a new appreciation of the poem's power and a fresh reading. Angeli's experience of hearing her feelings about the poem called wrong and her identification with the young woman in the poem called a misreading are common enough experiences for girls and young women in schools and universities. Recent research shows what as women we remember, that in a myriad of ways, girls and young women are given the message that their experiences and knowledge are not heard or welcomed in the classroom. Perhaps we should not be so surprised when we hear Elisar, 15, tell the woman who interviews her that she's never experienced work that she loved. See, that's what I want, she explains. I want to do some work that I love doing, but I don't know if it's in my nature to love work. To Elisar, and then you see, this is what I mean about listen. To Elisar, who radically splits work and love, education has little to do with personally trusting or believing. I don't think you have to trust anything to get a good education, she says. I don't think you have to trust any facts. You can know about them, but you don't have to believe in them to get a good education. Elisar has never had a teacher, she says, who, quote, really makes you think and care about what you're learning, who asks the type of questions that really makes you think so you feel exhausted, that really revitalizes and massages your brain. That would relate everything down to the personal level, how it's going to affect you, how you're going to get out the real emotion. She adds, feelings to understand or want to learn more about something. When girls are disconnected from what Audre Lorde calls the erotic root and satisfactions of their life work, girls' education can become, as Lorde might predict, a travesty of necessities. The girls in our study who kept their strong voices direct our attention to their mothers, but their mothers do not fit conventional images of good women, or I would say, conventional images of good mothers. Anna's mother is strong in her relationship with Anna, but in describing this relationship, Anna speaks of her mother screaming at her, and she feels her mother's feelings gnawing at her. I mean, these are relationships of very strong connection. Anna's mother is strong in her relationship with Anna, but 18-year-old Nawal, when asked how she has changed, described the changes in her relationship with her mother, which led to what she calls, quote, my big realization. Okay, she says, my mom has black, curly, wild hair, really dark skin, dresses like she wears a huge silver earring, does not fit the stereotypical Laurel School mother image, does not. This is a woman who comes in from the senior luncheon and she says, Nawal, am I dressed okay? And her hair was down and curly and she had enormous earrings, huge necklace, this black kind of fitted sundress thing, sandals, a lot of jewelry, and everyone was staring. And I love the way she dresses, and I love the fact that she's different, but when I was younger, it used to bother me, and I hated being Arabic. I hated being different, and I hated having an Arabic name, and I was really almost embarrassed by my mom. When Nawal's mother asked her directly, do you really want me to be like everyone else, Nawal took the question seriously. I thought about it for a while. At first I thought, yeah. And then I was like, wait. I thought about it, and I tried to picture my mother like that, and I just couldn't. It makes me shudder because that's not her. For Nawal, it was important to speak publicly about her realization. Devoting her senior speech to this subject, she voiced in the school's open assembly her resistance to American standards of beauty, the standards that led Nawal, a dark-skinned Arabic young woman, to wish for, quote, long, long blonde hair and blue eyes, and to judge herself and her mother as ugly or not beautiful. Nawal cried after her speech, her friends cried with her, and she felt this weight was lifted, and I finally said what I had to say to this school. Nawal's comment echoed almost precisely the words of women teachers who spoke of feeling that they were working under a great weight in teaching what they were supposed to be teaching rather than what they felt was important for girls to learn and know. And I think you can add teachers, mothers, therapists, and everyone in this situation. For many reasons, it was harder for these women to finally say what they had to say to the school, and yet some of them did so by the end of the project. And the women's voices were in fact disruptive and associated with substantial changes in the lives of some of the women and also in the school. In other words, what we found in this work was beginning with girls and then staying in connection with girls on the part of women, led women across a range of schools, not only Laurel School in Cleveland, but inner city schools in Boston, led women to begin to take significant action to bring about political change. You could not stay in connection with the girls without beginning to try to change the world. And in the absence or the feeling of impasse in trying to move toward change, there was a tendency to disconnect from the girls because it was just too painful. As we witnessed so many of the perfect girls in our study become the perfect woman, the modern superwomen Catherine Steiner Adair writes about, or the angel in the house whom Virginia Woolf described, we feel ourselves tempted momentarily to forget or discount the resistant voices of younger girls, the girls who say what they're feeling and thinking, the girls who hold to what they are experiencing, the whistleblowers in the relational world. In re-entering girlhood and remembering images of perfection and various forms of psychological foot-binding that are imposed on girls at the time when they become young women, we found ourselves turning to the girls in our study who, because of color or class, live in the margins, who are so clearly at odds with the dominant models of female beauty and perfection as to reveal the cultural hand behind the standards. These girls often spoke in loud voices, and among them we found many of our staunchest resistors. They tend to have close, confiding relationships with their mothers, or I would say with other women, relationships in which both mother and daughter speak, where they engage in open conflict and give voice to their feelings of anger and sadness, as well as their feelings of love and closeness, where both mother and daughter can feel the power they have to affect one another, and thus the real depths of their connection and love. It is for this reason that Nawal chooses her mother over the model. She cannot imagine a relationship with a model. So I want to end simply where we began, to come back full circle and to end with the voice of a girl, because that's the germ here, that's the starting point. And read you a short book called A Friend by Lily, age 8. And you might just think for a moment, a friend, what would a girl's book on friendship be? Dedicated to my friends. A friend is not only someone who comes over and plays games with you, a friend is also kind of like a relative. You treat them the same as any other person. Chapter 1, Making Friends. Making friends is easy with some people and hard with others. And you have to be careful because anything can happen and you will have to cope with it. Chapter 2. Chapter 2, Fights. When you and a friend get in a fight, don't worry because it's normal. Everyone gets in fights, right? Chapter 3, Race. When you want a new friend, do not judge people by race. Indians, English, Asians, anybody. Pretend you were from Afghanistan. That's where Lily's from. And a year ago, you moved to America. You have been living in America for a year, but you only have a few friends. But the point of making friends has nothing to do with race. Chapter 4. The end of friendship. In a real relationship, there is usually no end of friendship. Hey, it's up to you and your friend to keep your friendship together. Chapter 5, My Opinion. I hope you have learned something from this story. Good luck in making good friends. But remember, never judge someone by race. Thank you. Thank you. I'm very happy to answer some questions. Yes. Just, yeah. People can't hear, right? Voice. The voice workshop last weekend in October. Until now, actually, this Kristen will, and Normie Noel, who is part of the Harvard Project, who's doing this with Kristen, it will be an extraordinary weekend. She will teach you to speak so everyone here can hear you. But until then, I'll help. Yes, no, not all of it, but. Did you come across classrooms where we have a lot of meetings, we have all very, kids, but the girls refuse to speak. And I'm aware of all these things, I've always been aware of it. I try to encourage girls. Did you hear? This is an extremely important question. This woman is a teacher. She teaches in a class where there happen to be 20 boys and 9 girls, and the question has to do with the fact that she says the girls will not speak. First and second graders, so these girls and boys are 6 and 7. Let me just say that the first thing that occurred that I would say in response to that is there is a reason why they are not speaking. I mean, because from what you could take from this work is girls have voices. They have strong voices, and if girls are not speaking, there's a reason they're not speaking. They have either come to know something or come to believe that they will not be heard. And I think it's very smart not to speak if you feel that somehow you won't be. Now, the question then is, what do you do, right? Okay. I mean, because it happens all the time. I mean, it happens in first and second grade, and it happens on every single level, and it happens. And so I would say the first thing is to begin with the girls. Meet with them. Talk with them about the fact that they're not speaking. Say that you would like them to speak. I assume that you're interested in what they have to say. And I mean, think about Normie Noel, who also works in the theater and who will do this weekend with Kristen. Normie Noel talks about resonance in relationship. I mean, that the sense of speaking when it feels like a resonant place. She talks about what she calls a cello world, which I think is just wonderful, that you need a sounding board that will, make vibrations with your voice. And I have found that often girls are rather savvy about where they will and won't speak, but sometimes, so I would think that would be the first step. And in any case, I think it would be extremely interesting to find that out. I was going to say I could, but it's in the book and you can find it. And look for Lauren. Several of our girls didn't speak at all with certain interviewers, and then in the second or third or fourth year of the study, the interviewers shifted. And suddenly it was like the girl felt the interviewer would hear her. In one case, it was Sonia, a black girl with 2 white interviewers. In the third year, a black woman comes in. In the first 2 years, she'd been saying, I don't know, your questions don't make any sense to me. Meaning, I think that she felt that what she was going to say wasn't going to make any sense to the woman. And the third year, a very resonant black woman interviewer came in, and it was like suddenly there was Sonia speaking. And Lauren, who kind of backs off at a point where the interviewer, in a sense, again, the details of this I don't want to simplify, but she breaks the rules. She asks about breaking rules, and suddenly it gives Lauren permission to say what she knows. And she had been speaking before, but not really, and suddenly you can hear the difference. And the one thing I do want to say here, because it's a social class point, and it's an extremely important point, was for me, when we moved from the private schools, which, as I said, we were working there because it's the only place we got funding initially, and I think these girls' schools have to be given credit for that rather than denigrated for that. But when we moved into the public schools at first, I thought, oh, yes, these are the girls who are so deprived. You know, it's what you learn in psychology. And how can I help them, you know, that kind of thing. And they fit, it seemed to me, every stereotype I heard about. They were inner city girls, they were very racially mixed, they were often low social class, they came from what's called single parent household, which means mother only household. And to do some of these translations. And, you know, they sounded like a caricature of the television culture. They'd say, you know, do you have a house? Do you have a boyfriend? Do you have a car? You know, it was very stereotypical. And it would have been very easy for us as researchers to have said, aha. Well, these girls really pushed us and tested us about whether we were really going to listen, whether if they spoke we were going to listen, because they knew we had in our heads a zillion reasons to write off everything they were going to say. We could just shove them to this or this or this or this category. But it was this group of girls, when they had tested us, and I really mean tested us. This is the group that did the thing with the tape recorder. And that's the group where one girl said that we're talking about lying one day, telling lies. And this is the group where a girl said, my house is wallpapered with lies. And so what we discovered was, and they did extraordinary dramatic work, was that underneath this cover, it was an extremely clever cover, you could say. I mean, it was like they were living underneath it. And if you could get underneath, I mean, in some ways these girls moved us more deeply. Now, we couldn't possibly say what is generally said about this group of girls. So it's always interesting when girls aren't speaking, and I would start with the sense of, there's a reason. Yeah?
Could you comment on that study titled How Schools Shortchange Girls that wants single-sex education for girls?
Sure. Let me just say, I'm not the expert on, I've never done a study comparing single-sex and co-ed, so I can't, tell you what to do in that sense. But about the shortchange, I want to say 2 things. I like the title that says Shortchanging Girls, Shortchanging America, because I think the who's really shortchanged is everyone. I mean, that's half the population in the society, and it means, it leads to exactly the kinds of problems that this work challenges. But the second thing is, and I didn't go into this tonight, that a thesis that comes out of this work is that adolescence is for girls comparable in many respects to early childhood for boys. That is the time when they are at greatest psychological risk, in danger of losing their voices and losing relationship. For boys, the disconnection from women happens in early childhood. It's what's called separating from your mother. No, that's really, all that stuff about boundaries and separation and so forth, and boys start losing touch with the relational world, or if boys resist, they really get a lot of flack from the culture, but they're young. Girls struggle over this dissociation as at adolescence, and the difference is that whereas boys in early childhood are mainly in the family, girls in adolescence are in school. So the potential of schools to affect this process, for better or for worse, is enormous. And most schools are very patriarchal in the sense that you have a male hierarchy and then women working underneath, and so, sometimes doing an underground thing, such as women do, in their classroom and so forth. But it's very disturbing to the school, in a sense, to support girls, to really educate girls at that time. That is, what is education? To develop the capacity to feel deeply, to think clearly, to have the courage of outspokenness, to create resonant relationships. Well, that means changing the world. And I think it is shortchanging America to shortchange girls at that point. On the other hand, to educate girls and to stay with girls really will transform the schools. And the pressures on women teachers in the schools not to make trouble is enormous, just enormous. And again, no one can do this individually. What happened in our projects is we would start with the girls' voices, and the women would start talking about the fact that they had headaches and that they felt they were working under great pressure because they were not able to teach what they felt it was important to teach. And there were different pressures in co-ed, and in co-ed schools. One woman in response to this said that after doing 20 minutes of women's history, when the boys started to get restless, and say, do we have to do any more of this? Can't we just do history again, meaning men's history? That she remembered and stayed with the girls and said no, thinking about how it would affect the girls if she had done that. So the teacher in a co-ed school is in a very different situation because she's got to think about actively her relationships with the boys. But this is revolutionary education, simply to educate girls well. So the schools are in the middle of this, and that's why they come in a way that's different from the role of the school with boys, I think. Someone back there, yes, you had a question.
Yes, could you say something more about how the growing up experiences?
How, excuse?
How the growing up experiences of inner city and at-risk girls are similar to or different?
Right, how the growing up experiences of inner city girls are different from the girls in this. Yes, of course they're different. Their reality is different. And when you bring in different cultures, again, among our staunchest resistors were some of the girls who didn't fit the image of the perfect girl. And we're writing up that work right now in terms of talking about those differences, but there are class differences and there are cultural differences. The reality is different. But that there's an issue, yes, there's still an issue. So the kind of overall sense of, the costs are different, the consequences. So I think that's partly why we saw that cover in the elementary school. So, that would be another whole evening to really, because I would have to start with their voices and really show you. It's a good question. A couple of more questions? Yes? I think that one of the things, what can I say to you about good, I said relationships between women and girls are important. So first of all, simply to listen, and to listen with interest. Because often, as you saw, these examples I gave went in a slightly different direction than you thought they might originally. So that kind of be curious, listen. The second thing that's very hard is when girls see the framework and start talking about it, whether it's the framework of the household, or whatever their family is, or the school, or the research project. It's very easy for us as women to sort of push them in the framework rather than just stay with them. And I think the main, final thing to say is to see the problem doesn't mean you have to solve the problem. Because the fear, and I think this is where I'll end, the fear that girls have, go back to the impasse. Their fear is, if I say what I'm feeling and thinking, no one will want to be with me. In other words, I'll lose my relationships. And if I don't say what I'm feeling and thinking, no one will be with me. So the way to break the impasse is to be with them. Not to solve the problem, but just to say, if you say what you're feeling and thinking, I will stay with you. And and then, then you can begin a different kind of conversation about, and then we'll talk about how it is, what we know, what I know, what you know, what we feel, what we see, and what we could do. Because I think the moment gets lost when you break the connection at this point because it's too painful, because it's your daughter or because it's your mother or, whatever. And what I'm saying at the center of this work is something very, very simple. I mean, I find it in teaching. Jean Baker Miller and her colleagues at the Stone Center, Irene Stiver, Judy Jordan, Jan Sari write about it in therapy. Teachers who've worked with, if you stay with women and girls at those moments, I mean, if you stay with your daughter, she stays with you. In some ways, it seems like a very simple thing, but it really becomes tumultuous because suddenly then the disconnections and the dissociations don't have to happen. You can know what you know without being all alone. And the parameters of that conflict shift to something that's been psychologically damaging for women and debilitating for society into an open, different kind of both psychological and really deeply political conversation about the nature of the world we live in, the fact that women, are in this world, and the ways in which things can be different and we can move toward change. And that's why I'm saying a very simple act becomes a very radical act because it undoes the dissociation that maintains the status quo. And if your daughter's 10 now, as she approaches adolescence, and you just listen to her, and then listen to yourself and ask what happens as you stay with her. And, if you don't try to reimpose on this relationship and idealize the mother-daughter relationship, but just have your relationship with her, then that's basically what I'm talking about. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.